My son left me on a side of a mountain road in the middle of November, drove away in my own truck, and didn't look back once. The last thing he said to me was, "You should have just signed the papers, old man." I was 63 years old, standing in the dark with no phone, no jacket, and a knee that hadn't worked right since 1987. When he pulled into the driveway 2 days later, I was sitting in my recliner with a cup of coffee and a county sheriff's deputy on my couch. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up. My name is Walt. No, wait. I need to start somewhere that makes sense. Somewhere that explains how a man ends up betrayed by his own flesh and blood on a mountain road in eastern Tennessee. I spent 31 years working for a lumber company out of Knoxville. Not in an office, on the ground, in the yards, running equipment, managing supply chains before anyone called it that. I retired at 58 with a decent pension, a paid-off house on 4 acres outside Several, and 2 bad knees instead of 1. My wife, Lorraine, she passed 4 years before I retired. Ovarian cancer. Quick and cruel, the way that disease usually is. We had 41 years together, and I miss her every single morning when I pour my first cup of coffee, and there's nobody there to steal half of it. We had 1 son. I'll call him my son, because that's what he is and what he'll always be, even after everything. His name is Seth. He's 37 now, grew up in that same house, went to UT Knoxville on a partial scholarship, dropped out after 2 years, bounced around doing this and that, construction, real estate, a landscaping business that lasted about 8 months. He's always had big ideas and short attention spans. Lorraine used to say he got her imagination and my stubbornness, and somehow neither one came out useful in him. She said it with love. I think she meant it the same way. After Lorraine died, Seth moved back home for a while. Said he wanted to help me out. I appreciated that. I genuinely did. He took care of some things around the property, fixing the back fence, getting the gutters cleaned. We had some good evenings on the porch. I thought we were rebuilding something. I thought grief had softened him in the ways it sometimes softens people. What I didn't know was that grief had done something else entirely to my son. The trouble started small, the way it always does. He started asking questions about the house. Just curious, he said. Just wondering what property like this goes for these days. I told him I wasn't planning on selling. He dropped it. A few weeks later, he mentioned a business opportunity, something about buying into a storage facility franchise over in Maryville. He needed $40,000 to get started. He'd pay me back with interest, he said. He had a folder with paperwork and everything. I told him I'd think about it. I didn't give him the money. I had been around long enough to know that "I'll pay you back" from a 35-year-old who's never managed to finish anything is just a polite way of asking for a gift. He didn't take that well. Not explosively. Seth has never been a screamer. He went quiet in that particular way of his, where you can feel the temperature in the room drop about 10 degrees. He stopped coming around as much. Called less. I told myself that was fine. Grown man, his own life. I wasn't going to chase him. Then, about 8 months after the storage facility conversation, he started coming around again. Warmer this time. More like he used to be when he was younger and things were simpler between us. He'd show up on Sunday afternoons, watch football with me, help me stack firewood. Once he brought his girlfriend, a quiet woman named Sandra who seemed genuinely kind and a little nervous around him, in a way I filed away in the back of my mind. I let myself relax. Maybe I'd been too hard on him. Maybe he'd grown up some. One Sunday in late October, he said he wanted to take me up to Clingman's Dome before the road closed for the season. Highest point in the Smokies. Lorraine and I used to hike up there when we were young enough for that kind of thing. Seth knew that. He said he thought it would be a good trip for us, some time together. He'd drive. I'd just enjoy the ride. I should have thought more carefully about what he got out of a scenic drive. but I didn't. Because he was my son, and I wanted to believe we were okay. We left early on a Saturday morning. First week of November, cold but clear. Seth was in a good mood, talking more than usual, pointing out landmarks, stopping at a gas station to get me a coffee exactly the way I like it. Black, 1 sugar. I remember thinking that he seemed almost nervous, keyed up. I thought maybe he wanted to talk about something. Maybe he'd finally gotten himself together. Maybe there was news about Sandra. We drove up 441 into the park, past the visitor center, up the switchbacks. The trees were bare by then, just the skeleton branches against the gray sky. I had my window cracked because I liked the cold air in the mountains. Always have. About 2 miles below the dome parking lot, Seth pulled off onto one of the scenic overlooks. There was nobody else up there. November does that, clears the tourists out. He put the truck in park and sat there for a minute, not saying anything. I thought he was just taking in the view. I was doing the same. Then he said, "Dad, I need you to sign something." He reached into the back seat and pulled out a manila folder. Inside was a quitclaim deed for the house, for all 4 acres, transferring ownership to him. I sat there looking at it for a long moment. My name was already typed in. His name was already typed in. Someone had done this up professionally. There was a notary line at the bottom. I said, "Seth, what is this?" He said he needed it. He said he'd gotten into some trouble, real trouble, financial trouble, and that the house was the only way out. He said he'd let me stay there, that nothing would change for me day to day, but that he needed the asset in his name. He said the bank wouldn't talk to him unless there was collateral. I asked him what kind of trouble. He wouldn't say. Just kept saying he needed this, that I had to trust him, that he was my son. I told him no. I handed the folder back to him and I told him no. I handed the folder back to him and I told him no. Calmly. I wasn't angry, not yet. I just told him I wasn't signing anything on the side of a mountain without talking to my attorney, and that even after talking to my attorney, I probably wasn't signing my home over to him or anyone else, because that home was where I planned to live out the rest of my days, and where his mother's rose bushes still came up every May along the back fence. He got very still. That 10-degree drop again. He said, "You should have just signed the papers, old man." Then he got out of the truck, came around to my side, opened my door, and told me to get out. I thought he was joking. You don't joke about something like that on a mountain road in November with a man who's got bad knees and no jacket. But your mind doesn't immediately go to the worst version of your own child. So I thought he was joking. He wasn't joking. When I didn't move fast enough, he put his hand on my arm, not rough, almost gentle, which was somehow worse, and guided me out of the truck, like he was helping me out of a car at the grocery store. Like this was ordinary. He handed me my wallet, which I thought at the time was decent of him, and then he got in my truck and drove down the mountain. I stood there and watched my own taillights disappear around a curve. The temperature at Clingman's Dome in early November runs about 20 degrees colder than the valley. I wasn't dressed for it. I had on a flannel shirt and a canvas jacket, the kind that's fine for cool weather, but not for standing still on an exposed mountain road when the wind picks up. My knee was already aching from the altitude. I had my wallet and the clothes on my back and no cell phone because I'd left it on the kitchen counter that morning charging. I started walking down. What else do you do? The first mile was the hardest because of the knee and because part of my brain was still trying to process what had just happened. Your son just left you on a mountain. Your son drove away in your truck. Your son, who you took to his first Little League practice and taught to drive in the Kmart parking lot and sat with in the hospital waiting room the night his appendix came out when he was 19, that son just left you on a mountain. After a while, the processing stopped and the walking took over. One foot, then the other. Watch the road surface. Don't twist the knee. Keep moving. I'd gone maybe a mile and a half when a green Subaru came around the bend heading up. It slowed and stopped. There was a couple inside. I'd guess mid-50s, dressed for hiking. The woman rolled down her window and asked if I was all right. I told her I needed a ride down to the visitor center if they could manage it. I didn't explain why. She looked at her husband, he shrugged, and she said, of course. I got in the back seat. They asked if I needed a doctor. I said, no, just the visitor center. They were kind enough not to push it. At the visitor center, I used their landline to call my neighbor, a retired postal worker named Alan who has a key to my house and more common sense in his little finger than most people have in their whole body. I told him what happened. He didn't ask unnecessary questions. He said he'd call his daughter who works in the county prosecutor's office, and then he'd come pick me up himself. While I waited, I sat in a plastic chair by the visitor center entrance and drank bad coffee from a vending machine and watched the last of the afternoon light go off the mountains. I thought about Lorraine. I thought about what she would have said about this day. I decided she would have said something sharp and funny about the coffee, and then she would have held my hand, and by the time she was done holding my hand, I would have known exactly what needed to happen next. What needed to happen next was this. I needed to protect what we had built. Alan picked me up 2 hours later. His daughter had already made some calls. We drove home and I sat at my kitchen table with Alan and his daughter. Her name is Patricia. She's been with the county prosecutor's office for 11 years, and I told her everything. The quitclaim deed, the financial pressure he'd mentioned, the way he'd planned the whole trip, the folder already prepared, the isolated location. She asked me if I had any documentation of the deed. I told her I'd never touched it. Told her it was still in that manila folder, in whoever's hands it was in now. She told me what I needed to do. Over the next 2 days, I called my attorney and had him review everything connected to my estate. Turned out Seth had also, and I did not know this, taken out a life insurance policy on me 14 months prior. He'd added himself as beneficiary by accessing some old paperwork that still had a shared mailing address from when he lived with me. My attorney found it. I don't want to tell you what I felt when I found that out. I don't have language clean enough for it. I also filed a report with the Sevier County Sheriff's Department regarding the incident on the mountain. Abandonment, theft of a vehicle, my truck still not returned. Possible elder abuse under Tennessee statute, which Patricia had explained to me in detail over a second round of bad coffee at my kitchen table. On the second day, I changed the locks and the garage code, and I called a neighbor down the road to keep an eye out. On the morning of the third day, around 10:30, I heard my truck pull into the driveway. I was sitting in my recliner. There was a cup of coffee on the side table and 2 Sevier County Sheriff's deputies in my living room. We'd been waiting. I heard his boots on the porch steps. That particular sound I've heard my whole life, and then his key in the lock, which no longer worked, and then a pause, and then a knock. I nodded to one of the deputies. She opened the door. I watched my son's face move through about 6 different expressions in about 2 seconds. Surprise, confusion, recognition. Something I can only call calculation, like he was running numbers. And then, last, something that might have been shame. I'd like to believe it was shame. I'm not certain. The deputy spoke to him on the porch. He didn't run. I'll give him that. He stood there and he listened and he looked at the ground. When one of the deputies asked him to come in and sit down, he came in and sat down. He looked at me once, across the room. I looked back at him. I didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say that the situation wasn't already saying better than I could. He was taken in for questioning that afternoon. The truck was recovered. My attorney moved forward with the estate documentation. The life insurance situation is still being handled. That one is more complicated, and I'll leave it there. What I want to tell you, and what I've been thinking about since that morning in the recliner, is this. I don't hate my son. I know some people will read that and think I'm a fool. Maybe I am, but I raised him, and some part of me is always going to be standing in the Kmart parking lot watching a 15-year-old figure out how to ease off the clutch. That doesn't go away. I don't think it should go away. But I also know that love and trust are not the same thing. I loved Seth my whole life. I trusted him my whole life. And on a mountain road in November, he showed me exactly where that trust had gotten me. I made my peace with what I had to do. I cooperated fully with every investigation. I told the truth in every statement I signed. I did not make it harder than it needed to be, and I did not make it easier. In the spring, I had my neighbor Alan and his wife over for dinner. I made the pot roast recipe that Lorraine used to make on cold Sunday nights, the one with the red wine and the carrots, the one that makes the whole house smell like something good. We ate at the kitchen table and talked for 3 hours about nothing in particular and everything that mattered. Before they left, Alan's wife said, "You doing okay, really?" I told her yes. And I meant it. Lorraine's rose bushes came up that May, right on schedule, along the back fence where she planted them 20-some years ago. Pink ones on the left, red ones on the right. She had a system. They didn't know what had happened in this house over the winter. They just came up anyway, the way they always do, the way living things do when they've got good roots. I went out and stood by that fence in the early morning before it got warm, coffee in hand, and I looked at those roses for a long time. Then I went inside and started the day. I keep coming back to that folder. The quitclaim deed, already typed up, already formatted, sitting in the back seat the whole drive up the mountain. He hadn't decided to do this on the way. He'd planned it. He'd made copies, probably, or had someone prepare it for him. He'd chosen that overlook deliberately. No other cars, no witnesses, just the bare trees and the cold sky, and his father, who had no phone and bad knees and nowhere to go. That's the part people don't always sit with long enough. It wasn't a moment of rage. It wasn't a bad decision made in 5 seconds. It was premeditated. And that means somewhere along the way, my son looked at everything I'd given him, the roof, the years, the patience, the unconditional presence, and decided it was a resource to be extracted, not a relationship to be honored. I've thought a lot about how a person gets to that place. I don't think Seth was born without a conscience. I think he made a long series of small choices to ignore the one he had. Every time he borrowed money and didn't pay it back, every time he cut a corner and called it smart, every time he looked at a problem and asked, "What can I take from this?" instead of, "What can I build here?" he was practicing. He got very good at it. And eventually he practiced his way right to the edge of a mountain overlook with a folder full of paperwork and a father who trusted him. That's the thing about character. It doesn't announce itself. It accumulates quietly in the direction you keep choosing, until one day it becomes the person you are without even deciding to be. What I had to do after, the calls, the statements, the legal process, sitting in my own living room with sheriff's deputies, none of that was easy. There were mornings I didn't want to get up. There were nights I sat in the dark and just let the weight of it sit on my chest. But I made myself get up anyway. I made myself eat breakfast and return the calls and answer the questions and sign the right papers. Not because I felt strong, because the alternative was to let what he did finish the job he started, to let it take my home, my peace, the life Lorraine and I spent 40 years building together. Grief will make you passive if you let it. Betrayal will too. There's a version of the story where I sat down on that mountain road and waited to die of exposure rather than walk 1.5 miles to where someone could help me. I didn't sit down. I walked. That's all I know how to tell you about how I survived it. Alan once said to me, a few weeks after everything settled, "You handled that with more dignity than most people would have." I told him I didn't know about dignity. I just knew the difference between what was mine and what wasn't, and I wasn't going to let anyone take it. Not my property, not my clarity, not my ability to look at myself in the mirror the next morning. Seth made his choices. The law made its response. I made mine. And in May, the roses came up.